For the past 10 years, the Louis Burke Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College has presented free talks for the public by best-selling authors and great thinkers on the college's Upper East Side campus. This unique opportunity to meet exceptional individuals in an intimate setting with light refreshments has drawn guests from within and beyond New York City.
Hi, did you enjoy it?
Those of you who are writers know what I'm talking about. You have a little voice in your head, drives you crazy.
We're dancing with words, prancing with words.
As a result of the 2020 coronavirus pandemic and required social distancing, public gatherings such as our remaining 2 talks for the spring semester have unfortunately been canceled.
That was a wonderful, wonderful talk. Thank goodness we've recorded it.
Center Director Louis Frumkes has had each of the talks recorded for archives and to provide a copy of the talk to the speaker on DVD. The lectures were not intended to be made available online.
We have some incredible scientists coming.
That the universe just began.
Given the need for intellectual stimulation during this troubling time, the Frumkes Center is making many of our past talks available to view for a limited time each week, starting with the first recorded talk featuring Howard Gardner back in April of 2011, running through our most recent talk on March 9th, 2020 with Meg Wolitzer. Stay tuned to our website for more information about the videos available each week.
Good evening and welcome. My name is Louis Frumkes and I'm the director of the Hunter College Writing Center, CE, which is beginning its second exciting year here at Hunter at the invitation of President Rob. This fall, Daphne Merkin and Allison Esbach are teaching master classes for us, and we are offering a variety of classes from fiction to writing for the theater. On October 17th, Dr. Alan Manovitz will talk about his pioneering work with transmagnetic stimulation. This is something short of electroshock therapy that seems to be having remarkable results within transigent depression, and he's been pioneering this work, and he's also a very, very special man with great reputation. So I hope you'll enjoy that. That's the Jack Burston Memorial Lecture. And after today's market fall, probably a lot of us could make use of it. John Simon, the eminence grise of Broadway, will also be here in October. And then in November, Belle Kaufman, daughter of the great Yiddish writer Sholem Aleichem, and author of Up the Down Staircase, who's looking forward to her 101st birthday, will talk about her grandfather's humor. I myself will moderate a panel of some of our most talented new novelists also in November, and our Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney Connor guest writer Francine Prose, one of America's finest, will hold forth on the 14th. But let me begin with tonight's first event of this year, which is the opening of the Tina Santee Flaherty Irish Voices literary series, which over the years has hosted some memorable people. Let me tell you a little about Tina for those of you who do not know her. Tina Flaherty is a dear friend of mine, a major benefactor of the Writing Center, and the underwriter of the Irish Voices series, which has featured the McCourt brothers, Mary Higgins Clark, Ed O'Brien, Nuala Phelan, Colin McCann, and a host of other great Irish-American writers, including our speaker tonight, Pete Hamill. Next year, we are planning a major surprise for you, but more about that in the spring. Tina is a distinguished businesswoman, philanthropist, and when you get right down to it, a force of nature. There is very little this Southern belle cannot accomplish when she wants to, and a great deal that she has already accomplished. She has been described by Business Week as one of America's top corporate women, designated by another media trumpet as one of the original power chicks, and has blazed new trails for women everywhere. She produced the Dinah Shore Golf Classic for television, became the first vice president of 3 of America's leading corporations, Colgate-Palmolive, GT&E, and Gray Advertising, established Santee Giorno, a style and branding company, and as if this were not enough, our little beauty from Memphis penned 6 books in her spare time, including What Jackie Taught Us, a fascinating insight into her neighbor, Jackie Kennedy Onassis, who occupied the other penthouse across from her on Fifth Avenue. I am pleased to give you Tina Santee Flaherty, who in turn will introduce Pete Hamill and will act as your host this evening. Tina?
I always like Louis to introduce me. He does such a good job. Thank you again, Louis, for that lovely introduction. But I have to tell you that Louis does more than just give lovely introduction. Louis is really the heart and the soul of the Writing Center. And many a time when the Writing Center didn't have any money, Louis has just dug down in his pocket and, funded the year himself. So I always make a plea on behalf of Louis that if any of you ever do want to help and make a contribution, I know Louis would very much appreciate it. Well, as Louis mentioned to you, this is our 5th and final year of the Irish Voice Literary Series. And we've had a fantastic run, as any of you have. I see a lot of you in this room who, Joan Wynett, who've been with us all the way through. We've had everyone from Frank McCourt, a friend of Pete's, who won the Pulitzer for Angela's Ashes, to Edna O'Brien, as Louis mentioned, to Colin McCann, who won the National Book Award. So it's been a great 5 years. Yeah, but next year we'll tell you more about, as I say, the surprise. It's still a surprise. Speaking of great writers, we've got one right here tonight in front of us. We've got Pete Hamill. And, it would take more than, I went on Google, I went on Wikipedia and all like that. It would take more than 1,000 words to really describe you or do you justice, but I'll just do a little bit. You probably read in the Writing Center brochure that Pete wears many hats. He's a renowned journalist, he's a novelist, he's an essayist, he's an educator, he's an editor, and more than that, he is also a distinguished writer in residence at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute at New York University. But best for all of our purposes tonight, Pete is Irish. And Pete not only broke through that green ceiling, as the Irish like to call it, he scattered the pieces far and wide. But really, before I go into that, I think I better give you just a little bit of background about Pete. Now, Pete is the eldest of 7 children. His Catholic parents immigrated from Belfast in Northern Ireland. I just found out part of my branch is from Northern Ireland, too. Pete was born in the Park Slope section of Brooklyn, and he credits his mother, Anne Devlin Hamill, for letting him know that life has many possibilities out there, and especially for him. Now, it appears from the very beginning that everybody thought you were a pretty smart kid. And he was doing cartoons and all like that and wanted to be an artist, but everybody knew Pete was smart. And he got a very prestigious scholarship from Regis, which is, not so far away from here. But I know you ultimately dropped out, but 59 years later, they did give you an honorary degree. After college. Okay. As I just mentioned, at first Pete thought he wanted to be an artist because he was always drawing these cartoons. So consequently, in the fall of 56, I think it was, you went to school in Mexico City and you studied to be a painter. But after 1 year of studying to be a painter, you decided you didn't want to be a painter. You wanted to be a writer instead. So Pete started his career as a writer. He began his career in the summer of 1960, journalism, and he went to work as a reporter for the New York Post. There was a prolonged newspaper strike then, 62 and 63, and then that led you to writing magazine articles. Shortly after that, he was roaming all over Europe as a correspondent for the Saturday Evening Post. He interviewed actors, actresses, directors, novelists, and just plain ordinary people, I read. At the end of that year, he came back to New York, and by the fall of 1965, he started writing a column for the New York Post. During that time, Pete became a friend of Senator Robert F. Kennedy. And in fact, Pete, I think you were one of the ones that helped persuade him to run for the presidency on the Democratic ticket. After Senator Kennedy won the California primary, he gave a victory speech, as you may remember, at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. And when he finished his speech, he was going off to meet the press, and he wandered through the kitchen corridors, and there he was brutally assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan. Well, Pete was one of the 4 men who wrestled the gun away from Sirhan Sirhan, which I don't think a lot of people know. Pete's newspaper career went on for decades, and from the beginning, he's been a generalist, always a generalist, not a specialist, as he's written about war, riots, politics, jazz, rock and roll, boxing, baseball, and art. According to Pete's website, if it's up to date, it says you've written 20 books. Is that right? 21, okay. Including a much-publicized memoir, A Drinking Life, which I just bought a copy of, which was both a critical and commercial success. He's achieved celebrity status in his own right, and he has a very distinctive voice, Irish or otherwise. In closing, a New York Times article quoted Pete as saying, and he quotes one of my very favorite poets, William Butler Yeats, "People become writers in the first place by those things that hurt you into art. Then they become separated from what started out affecting them. Journalism forces you to look at the world so you don't get cut off." Pete, it's obvious you never got cut off. So thank you, and now the floor is all yours.
Well, it's great to be here, obviously, and to be in your company. And it is true that I'm Irish American. I don't wake up in the morning to go to work and say, I'm Irish, I'm Irish. I'd never get anything done because there's so many ways to be Irish, as many ways as there are to be American, and as many ways as there are to be from Brooklyn. But I'm proud of that description, because for my mother and father, America was the place they came to begin. For the people like them, whether they were Italian or Jewish or whatever, they didn't have any ambitions as grand as having a career. That was going to be for their kids. So they took the jobs they could get, particularly those who were here during the Depression. I was born in 1935. And the Depression in that neighborhood in Brooklyn lasted until about 1953, I think. I still insist on washing the dishes after having dinner with my wife. My ambition is to become the Jacques Pepin of dishwashing. Because in the kitchen of our flat in 378 7th Avenue in Brooklyn, there was no steam heat, but for some reason there was hot water. So on a winter night, if you could get to wash the dishes, it was paradise. My brother Tom would dry, but I washed. And yet, we were not impoverished. For one reason, basically. We were 2.5 blocks from a library put there by my favorite rich guy of all time, Andrew Carnegie, who built 1,600 libraries before he died. And the library is where, in some ways, I began my life. My mother took me there for the first time. I don't quite remember it. I don't remember learning how to read, which means she probably taught me the basics. I do remember the first book I fell in love with, Babar. I mean, this elephant in a green suit, so he must have been Irish, right? Going with a woman as his guide to this great, amazing metropolis that my mother explained was Paris. It doesn't say that in the book, but she explained it to me. So I grew up with this notion of Paris as being this magical place somewhere. But I went from Paris to the rest of the library slowly over 3 or 4 or 5 years, moving up on the reading list, choosing the books often by the gorgeousness of the illustrations. I loved all the books with paintings by N.C. Wyeth, books that really got into me somehow. I went to Treasure Island. Who could be poor if you could go with Jim Hawkins to Treasure Island? I had adventures. I was in the Chateau d'If with Edmond Dantes one whole summer, reading it on a cellar board around the corner from our house. The library promised magic and delivered it. I also became a fan of things that were less than literature. I was a great fan of the Bomba the Jungle Boy books. They were about this kid who crash landed in the Amazon jungles, a total knockoff of Tarzan, with his parents, and lost his parents and found his way for the next 20 books. So that when I'm asked sometimes about the book that changed my life, I always say Bomba the Jungle Boy at the Giant Cataract. It was the first one I finished. And they were written by someone named Roy Rockwood, which had to be the name used by every poor, low-down newspaper man who had to make some fast money and wrote these books in 9 days or something. But they were great. One of the people I came to know later and loved very much was Louis Auchincloss. No two New Yorkers could have led different childhoods, except he was an amazing fan of Bomba the Jungle Boy too. So we would exchange books when I would find one in some place. Bomba the Jungle Boy at the Swamp of Death, and I would send it off. And he said, "Peter, old boy, that's a real good one," you know, and we'd talk about Bomba the Jungle Boy and the effect on us. But the biggest effect, and the great stroke of life, of luck for someone who ended up being a writer, was that I grew up before television. There was no television. It wasn't there yet. The radio was, and the radio very much resembled reading because you heard the words and you had to actively use your brain to imagine pictures to match those words. So it was great training that way, even though some of the stuff I listened to was Captain Silver and the Sea Hound, you know, that kind of stuff. But I also discovered comic books, which were so much different from the comic strips in the Daily News, for example, of some of which were brilliant, and I came to understand later, Terry and the Pirates by Milton Caniff, and some other really wonderful ones. But the comic books, particularly Batman, and a comic book called The Spirit, really made me feel like they were about the world I knew. Batman, unlike Superman, who was adult, you know, I mean, you fire bullets at his head, they bounce off, you know. But Batman had no superpowers. He lived in the Batcave with his kid assistant named Robin. But they lived in a world in which the Joker was the most evil presence of shadows, a world of deep shadows, of industrial buildings, of things that happened in the dark of the night when neighborhoods like mine made you at least wary, even looking out the window. And The Spirit was about a guy named Denny Colt who lived in a cemetery called Wildwood. The cemetery nearest to my house where I lived was Greenwood Cemetery. And we would go sometimes when I was 10 or 11, 3 or 4 of us would go over there as soon as it got dark to climb over the fence and test our ability to resist fear by playing hide-and-go-seek among the tombstones. It was like the opening of Great Expectations. you didn't know who was in there. So Greenwood Cemetery and the shadows of the world in those days were essential to what later became my impulse to try to write myself. I could draw, so I began drawing. I drew comic books in these little composition books, which you could divide up into panels, and that was the first kind of writing and drawing. I had a character named the Red Bat. I think he lived in the Bronx. You know, he was like, but I learned something about narrative. This happens, and as a result, this happens. It's essential to any kind of writing. It's why, in the long run, although I tried to be a painter for a while, in the long run, it's why I became a writer. Because stories, narratives, the things that are so essential in certain ways to the Irish, among many other kinds of people, but the Irish themselves, particularly in the years where there was enforced illiteracy, where the British wouldn't let them learn how to read, wouldn't let them leave Ireland to go to universities in Europe during the penal laws. They somehow found a way to write stories and create stories. And so I think in all the people you've had in this series, I think all of them came from giants who couldn't read, but who triumphed. And in my house, the reading was done mainly by my mother. She had been better educated. She had graduated from high school in Belfast, which was incredibly unusual for women in those days. Usually women left school at 14, went to work in the linen mills until they got married and vanished from the world in some way. And my father, his style was shaped by Belfast, because Belfast, it was dangerous to talk too much. Seamus Heaney has a great poem that expresses the Belfast style perfectly. It's called, "Whatever you say, say nothing." That was perfect to describe the Belfast style and the style of my father. He had lost a leg playing soccer in the 20s, so he couldn't cash in on all the things the Irish working class were able to find their way into. He couldn't work as a construction worker. He couldn't work on the waterfront. And so almost everybody in our neighborhood lived off the commerce of the port, either as longshoremen or people unloading and loading trucks and stuff down on the docks. So he couldn't do that. But he had very good handwriting. And that was the result of some nun who, when she discovered he was left-handed, beat the left-handedness out of him until he wrote right-handed, which is not an odd story. The more people I meet who grew up in that era in Ireland, there's a lot of converted southpaws. Some Tammany guy saw his handwriting on a piece of paper, got him a job way down on Smith Street in Brooklyn for a grocery chain where he was a clerk through the Depression. Finally got to make $18 a week and was able to start a family. They were not people who thought work was a chore or a task. It was probably the most important four-letter word they knew after free. So work was the example. My mother worked at everything. When she first came, she was a domestic working for a family in Brooklyn, a well-off family, as they said in those days. but very decent people, because I remember the year I was 10, they sent to our house in that place where I was washing the dishes sometimes in August, the collected works of Mark Twain. Every one of us read all of them. Not just Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, but Roughing It and Life on the Mississippi and all the other stories by this amazing guy who made us laugh. We weren't making judgments about him being a great artist. We didn't know what that meant when we were reading them. But that gift from a family to a woman they knew as an honorable woman who believed in work was essential to us growing up. After the war, she got a job in the maternity ward of the Methodist Hospital in Brooklyn, still there. It was the baby boom. I used to walk her there sometimes. It was like the Rolling Stones were playing inside the hospital or something. It was mob scenes, all these GIs who had made it back alive, who weren't interested in careers themselves, did not take the educational benefits of the GI Bill, and ended up in Levittown and places like that, because they didn't want to live in tenements anymore. But the baby boom was booming. There were kids crying in doorways and hallways all over the Methodist Hospital. The racket was beyond belief. There were these poor, clumsy-looking guys who survived the Battle of the Bulge, looking in and trying to hold the babies like they were time bombs or something, which they might have been, some of them. And then she went to work at the RKO Prospect on 9th Street, just below the library. She was the cashier at night. She'd start at 5 and work until 9. And she had a deal with all my younger brothers. You can get into the movie house free, but first you got to go to the library and get a library card. And you got to show me that you're taking books out and actually reading them. So that was the deal. They had to watch some of the worst free movies in the history of the world. Mario Lanza movies, Toast of New Orleans or something. But sometimes life at the RKO Prospect was even more wonderful than we could imagine. One night, they used to have a paging system there because of the Methodist Hospital. So if some doctor was at the movies and they needed to call him up to the hospital, they could come in paging Dr. Kildare or something. But this one night, a guy showed up and goes to the usher up at the top and says, "I have to page somebody, please." "Yes, sir, follow this way." "What's the party's name?" "Willie Pagano." So he goes in down the first aisle, paging Willie Pagano. Flashlight on the floor, paging Willie Pagano. Nothing. Up to the front, across, back up again, paging Willie Pagano. Paging Willie Pagano. Finally, a guy says, "I'm Willie Pagano," at which point the guy takes out a gun, shoots him to death, and walks out the door. The next day, the RKO chain canceled the paging facilities at all their theaters in New York City. And I thought this was some urban tale, except when I went to work at the Post finally, I finally looked up the clips in the library. It really happened. Paging Willie Pagano. I don't think they ever caught the guy that did the shooting. But the point of a lot of that was that the life we had was not grim. We never felt, I never felt poor. What more did we want? We had sneakers that will probably last 3 or 4 months the way we use them. That's all. The food, it was Irish food. And I remember a couple of years ago reading a book, A History of Paris, in which they tell the tale of the founding of Paris when a Celtic tribe wandering through gets to the site and sees the Ile de la Cité. It has no name, but it's got water on both sides. And what's better than this? And they settled right in there, and because they were the Parisi, it was Paris. So I called my friend Clyde Haberman of the Times, and I said, Clyde, I know now why I love Paris so much. And it's not just Babar. Yes, Pete. The Celts founded it. And there's a pause, and Clyde says, if that's the case, why is the food so good? And I said, because they had the good sense to get conquered by the Romans instead of the Brits, who think food is fuel. And so he laughed. But that sense that there was a world out there was driving me from the beginning, which is why I couldn't go to Paris on the GI Bill. Even then, I couldn't afford it, but I could afford Mexico. And it changed my life. I learned how to tell stories. I couldn't figure out how to do paintings that had that narrative sense that's in, kids' fiction, comic strips, all of it. I couldn't figure out how to do that. There must be a way to do it, but I couldn't figure it out. And I started writing stories. But my first publication in print was not at the New York Post. I was working as the art director for a Greek magazine called Atlantis. It was published on 23rd Street, right where the High Line is, 23rd Street and 10th Avenue, 10th and 11th. And I was the art director. I'd lay out 40 pages plus the front and back cover. And the editor was a Greek-American guy named Jim Vlasto, still my friend. And his father was Solon G. Vlasto. He couldn't read Greek either, the son. So we're in a bar on 23rd Street one night, and he said, maybe we should get an English story into the thing once a month. And I said, well, who would write it? He said, why don't you try it? I said, okay. So I knew the boxer, Jose Torres, one of my closest friends for 50 years. And I said, Jose, I got to write a piece about you for the Greek magazine. He says, Greek magazine? Yes. So I sit him down and talk to him, write the story. Jimmy puts it in the magazine. We both get called in by the publisher. He's holding the magazine like it had an odor of some kind. And he says, why is in a Greek magazine a story about a Puerto Rican guy written by an Irish guy in English? And Jimmy saved my career. He said, Dad, the young Greeks love him. He knew that his father had never even met a young Greek. So he saved my life. I wrote a couple later, one about Melina Mercouri or something, and to get a Greek angle into it. And then I went to work for the Post that summer of 1960. The writing part of it, and I do talk to youngsters down at NYU a lot about it. I was an autodidact, which is sometimes sneered at, but is in fact true of every writer I know. You essentially educate yourself. You educate yourself by reading the greatest books ever written. You teach yourself in various ways. I was lucky in the Navy that in the base library in Pensacola where I was, they had Hemingway and Fitzgerald and a whole lot of people writing about them. I don't know who put this library together. It was a great book by Malcolm Cowley called Exile's Return. All of that helped me understand that that writing was a craft like any other craft, and you had to learn how to make something. So that by the time I finally went to the Post, I actually knew more about writing than any formal education had taught me. I knew it by reading. I also had editors who, out of a sense of pity and compassion, realizing that I didn't know a goddamn thing about anything, helped educate me. One of them was my editor, Paul Sand. You mentioned Shalom Aleichem here. I remember him coming to me one night and saying, "Read this. Your tribe's in it too." And it was collected stories of Shalom Aleichem. And of course, Tevye the dairyman was Murphy the milkman. I mean, he was right. I mean, there was no difference between the shtetl in Eastern Europe or Russia and the small villages of Ireland, where so many people have been shaped by the smallness and the narrowness, forced into understanding people on a more intimate way than you ever get in a large city. So people like that were educating me too. And I had really tough standards for myself. I never felt like I was doing it as well as I could. When I finally got hired, it took 4 months before they hired me, and I got a real press card with my name on it. I wore it to bed for a month, like a dog tag. I am somebody, as Steve Martin said in The Jerk, you know. But I understood that the craft was going to be a lifetime engagement, that to become a good writer, to become a good anything, means that you have to think it's important. And you have to think that it's important enough to spend those extra hours to do it again until you get it right. To get it right on deadline is even harder. So newspapers taught me speed and accuracy. But they also sent me out into the world to meet people who needed someone like me to show up. One thing that happened with my mother when I was young, about 9, was a trip we took. She used to take us, my brother Tommy and I, he's 2 years younger than me, and she was always looking for cheap entertainments to keep us focused. We loved going to the West Side piers to see the wreck of the Normandy, which burned at its pier in 1942. And each time she took us, there was less of the Normandy. They were taking it apart and using the metal for scrap metal or something. And we were going there one day going down 43rd Street, it must have been. And there was a guy in the doorway with a cup, not a paper cup, but a cup. And he was begging what in those days they called a bum. And my brother Tommy and I started giggling and laughing at him. And she lost it. And she said, "Don't you ever look down on anybody unless you're giving them a hand to get up." And that stayed with me to this day. When I was a newspaper man, I realized very early that I could help some people who'd been knocked down to get up. The first byline that I had, there was a guy out in Brooklyn somewhere who'd been evicted from his house, a phenomenon that happened in those days and now we're seeing again. And he had 3 kids and a wife, all standing out in the rain. And they sent me out because I knew a little bit about Brooklyn, and went and interviewed this guy in the rain. He was sitting up on a bureau, and I talked to him. He'd lost a job. He couldn't get another job. He didn't know what he was going to do. There were no homeless shelters in 1960 to speak of. And I wrote the story, and they put my name on it for the first time in the paper. The paper came out at 9 o'clock in the morning. By 11:30, he had 3 job offers and 2 offers for places to live from the readers, not from any social service agency or anything like that, which do honorable work, but from the readers. And I think that function of the newspaper is the one we got to be so careful about losing, because that's a possibility. We're going to lose a sense of the local. We're going to lose a sense of the people who are hurting, that have to be, whose plight has to be brought to life and brought to focus, and something be done about it. So I was lucky to be working at a newspaper that didn't sneer at stories like that. I was also lucky because so many good people were there. I mean, I was at a memorial for one of them the other day, the great Joe Wershba, who was working there as a newspaper man, having been eased out of CBS for being too involved in the campaign against Joe McCarthy and lost his job. He's a figure in that Good Night and Good Luck movie. He died at 90, but he came back. He went to the Post, worked there, then went back to CBS and became one of the founding producers at 60 Minutes and did about 70 pieces for 60 Minutes over the years that came. But he was one of the guys who would come over and say, look, why don't you do this? Move this paragraph up here. Move that little word there. Put it down there and cut that word. He was one of those guys trying to help the young people in the business, the young people in the city room. There were other people, Paul Sand the most important, who really helped me, but basically it was the whole communal feeling, the things we laughed about, the sense of a team. I felt like I was working at the Basie band half the time. The sense that, yes, the reporters were some of the worst husbands in the history of the world. Some of the women were not much better. But there was more laughter than any of us ever thought we deserved. We learned to laugh at homicides. We learned to laugh at any kind of good scoundrel who showed up that didn't hurt the young or the old. Was a moment of great release working on newspapers in those days. There were 7 of them. And I was lucky to spend a lifetime there without it stopping me from trying other things. So the part of me that wanted to tell stories about people one at a time that couldn't be satisfied in journalism, I began to write fiction too. 1968, I published my first book. For those of you who have people that are interested in it, one of the things I found was the worst kind of book to read about writing fiction is a book about writing fiction. Some of the most useful books were books about acting. By Michael Chekhov or Uta Hagen or Stanislavski, because they were about making emotion visible. They weren't about some highfalutin theory of one class versus another. They're not talking about that. That's for a certain kind of criticism that can be very useful and entertaining, but doesn't, I don't think, make you a better writer. But the acting books, because all of fiction came out of theater, in those days when most people were illiterate, we had Shakespeare playing out in the Arizona Territory in the West because people could get it by listening. They couldn't read it, but they got it. It was theirs too. So I think theater was a thing that in certain ways showed me a way to find my own style, my own way of looking at the world. The Irish part of me, I didn't go to Ireland for the first time till 1963. I had been sent to Europe by a magazine called the Saturday Evening Post. And I did some of the dumbest work in my life. I did all these interviews, as you mentioned, I interviewed Brigitte Bardot and Sophia Loren and young Sean Connery and young unknown Michael Caine, and I have never reprinted any of them. But they gave me Europe, and I have I was writing one clear memory of writing a piece about a producer named Joe Levine. I loved him. He didn't smoke, but he felt like he had a cigar in his fingers all the time. And he's a guy who started out making Steve Reeves movies, some of the worst, and then began to make very good movies in Italy. And I was one night, while I was writing about him, at a table on the Via Veneto in Rome, and at the table was Federico Fellini, Marcello Mastroianni, and Be Still My Heart, Claudia Cardinale. And I was being paid to sit there. And I said, how the hell did this ever happen? In fact, I was sitting next to Fellini, actually, and talking about comic strips, because he started out as a cartoonist and then became a movie director. We were talking about the backgrounds in Crazy Cat, which he thought, and I agreed, were the most beautiful landscapes in all of comic book history. To have that conversation, I was not even 30 yet, is one of those things sticks in my head forever, about the joys of being a journalist, to just go there and do that. But I was also learning about how other people lived. And I was coming there and learning about them. As a New Yorker, I was already a New Yorker. I had it in me. I would go and look at things, not as an American particularly. I never felt that. I mean, I didn't start swelling up and weeping on the 4th of July or anything. New Yorkers don't do that. We did it at 9/11, the only time in my lifetime where I saw people wearing flags and stuff, which was a wonderful moment. But New Yorkers don't do it any more than they walk into a bar and start talking about how much they love their wives. As soon as they say that, we know he's cheating. You know, anybody that would do that in public, go around the corner and buy a paper and come back. The rest is going to be nonsense. But I was learning about the other part of the world. And finally, in the fall of 1963, I went to Ireland. I had made some dough, and I bought my father a ticket and had him come over and meet me there. I didn't have enough to bring my mother, and she couldn't leave with all the other young thugs that were living in the house, my younger brothers. But I wanted to see the place where he'd been young, and to get a better sense of the things that had hurt him into exile. And so we met in Belfast. He stayed with his twin brother, the brother who had stayed in Ireland while my father went to America. They hadn't seen each other in 30 years. He stayed with them. The brother who stayed in Ireland was 20 pounds thinner than his twin brother, my father. So the diet was different, clearly. And I stayed with my cousin Frankie Bennett way up on the top of Belfast. And I would meet him during the day, and we wandered down into the old neighborhoods that he lived in and drank in, and into different bars, the Long Bar and the Beehive and the Rock Bar up on the corner of the White Rock Road. And I began to get a better sense of it, you know. On the fourth or fifth day that we were there, he went to see a friend that he used to play football with, who had become a writer. His name is Michael McLaverty, and he was the principal of a school up past where my father's twin brother lived. We went there to the school, and they met each other, and both of them started weeping, and they just hugged each other. They didn't say it much at all, because McLaverty had stayed, and Billy was the Yank, you know. And finally we settled down. I was talking to him about what the kids learn in the school and all that. And he says, wait a minute, there's a teacher here you ought to meet. He's not bad. And in comes, he calls out, and in comes a young guy just out of college named Seamus Heaney, who was teaching at that school, and later wrote a couple of wonderful essays about Michael McLaverty. And that's how I met Seamus Heaney, not knowing yet what he would become. I also, on my own, with one of my American friends, went into a bar one day. I was still drinking in those days. And I saw a guy at the bar, and I said, he looks awfully familiar, and I realized who it was. It was Patrick Kavanagh, one of the really great Irish poets of that period, before there was a chance for people like Heaney and others to come and go to Harvard and to somehow make a living out of work. And he was a kind of bitter guy. But I saw him at the bar, and I said, geez, I was also writing a little column for the Sunday book review of the Herald Tribune. And I thought this would be a good piece for them. And I went up to him and I said, Mr. Kavanagh, my name is blah, blah, blah. I do some work for the Herald Tribune. I'd love to sit down with you and talk about poetry, Ireland, all the rest. He was a tall guy. And he looked at me and said, fuck off. So I burst out laughing. I thought, this is great. I said, you can't make this guy up. And I went over and told my friends, and later when I got to know Heaney pretty well, he always wanted me, he says, tell the story about Patrick Kavanagh, would you, for Christ's sakes. But wandering around Belfast in particular, I loved Dublin, I loved the old Georgian houses, I loved the sense that Joyce walked here, that Jonathan Swift walked here, and I would trudge all over the place. Afterwards I would always go to say my little prayer to Jonathan Swift for being the great Irishman that he was. But Belfast, the sense that you couldn't just have fun. My father was a singer of songs. That's how we communicated. He would sing ballads like Eileen O'Roon, you know, castles are sacked in war, chieftains are scattered far, truth is a fixed star, Eileen O'Roon. But he would more often sing Paddy McGinty's Goat. Mr. Patrick McGinty, an Irishman of note, he fell into a fortune and he bought himself a goat. A goat's milk, said Paddy, I think I'll have me fill. But when he got the nanny home, he found it was a bill. And the other one, which is, I always remember, the great challenging one. The title was, I had a hat when I came in, and I'll have a hat when I go out. And that's the one that I always think of when I think of it. But to get, the troubles had not yet begun. It was 1963. Ian Paisley was already making speeches about the Pope in Rome and the Papist flight and all the other stuff. But the troubles hadn't begun. And one night, I'm going to read a section of Drinking Live. One night in my cousin Frankie's house, I was getting ready to go out, meet my father and my uncle Frank. And the television was on, and I was getting dressed. I gotta find the page here. And my first wife was there. She with my little daughter, who was a year old at the time. And there was a lot of noise and laughter and all kinds of stuff going on. And then the first bulletin broke. President Kennedy has been shot in Dallas. What? I turned to the black and white screen of the television set. What did he say? What did he just say? And he said it again, grave, British, restrained. Shots had been fired at the presidential motorcade in Dallas. No. The president was being rushed to Parkland Hospital. No. The room hushed. Frankie moved in from the kitchen. Ramona, my wife at the time, came downstairs holding Adrian in her arms, my daughter. Frankie's wife stood by the set. No. I popped open a can of warm lager. The sitcom was playing. Then the announcer was back. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the President of the United States, is dead. I let out a wail, a deep, scary banshee wail, primitive and wounded, mariachi wail, Hank Williams wail, full of fury and pain. No. Ramona hugged me, weeping, and kids were wailing now, and Frankie was there beside me, but I turned, ashamed of my pain and my weeping, and rushed into the night. All through the Catholic neighborhood called Andersonstown, doors were opening and slamming, and more wails came roaring at the sky. Wails without words, full of pagan furies as old as bogs. I wanted to find my father, wanted to hug him and have him hug me. But I careened around dark streets in the midst of the wailing. I saw a man punch at a tree. I saw a stout woman fall down in a sitting position on a doorstep, bawling. I ran and ran, trying to burn out my grief, my anger, my consciousness. I found myself on the Shankill Road, main avenue of the Protestant district. It was no different there. Kennedy wasn't a mere Catholic. He was Irish. Kennedy was ours. He was one of our sons, our Jack, and they have killed him. Along the Shankill, I saw a man kicking a garbage can over and over again in primitive rage. I saw 3 young women heading somewhere, dissolved in tears. I saw another man sitting on a curb, his body heaving in gigantic sobs. Somehow I found my way back to the Falls Road in the Catholic area. My head was full of imagined demons. The gunmen of Dallas, Cuban exiles and right-wing bastards, Klansmen and mob guys. But when I finally reached the Rock Bar, I only wanted to find my father. He was upstairs where the television set was, sitting at a table beside a retired IRA man with 3 fingers missing from his right hand. I went to the table and the old IRA man said, "It's a terrible bloody thing, lad. Terrible, terrible." My father stood up, his face a ruin. We held each other tight, saying nothing, and then the bar was packed and we drank whiskey, and there was a documentary playing about Kennedy's trip to Ireland in May, smiling and laughing and amused, promising at the airport to come back in the springtime. And I thought of the line from Yeats, "What made us think that he could comb gray hair?" After that, there was almost nothing left except whiskey, until the screen filled with Kennedy's face, superimposed on the American flag, while the Star-Spangled Banner played on the soundtrack. And then the whole bar crowd was standing, old men and young, men with hard, whiskey-raw Belfast faces, and all of them was saluting, and so was my father, and so was I. That night in Belfast, we both discovered how much we were Americans. And I think it's that thing that a lot of us who've been Irish American understand, that there are things about the America part of Irish America, the second part after the hyphen, that are ours too, just by showing up, just by doing something with our lives to try to prove that the agony of separation from the old country was worth the journey, that we have done as well as anybody that ever came here and had a shot at it, that we owe what happened to us to the Mexicans. We got to give them the same shot that we had. They have the same colors in the flag, for God's sakes. And they had a great general named Obregon who had red hair and freckles, and many Mexican historians are convinced his real name was O'Brien, and they couldn't say it right, so they turned it into Obregon. That if you go to Mexico City on St. Patrick's Day and go to San Angel, on the wall in San Angel is the monument to the San Patricios, those Irishmen who went to Mexico and fought against the Americans all the way to Mexico City and were executed. They were not American citizens yet, but they figured out they were on the wrong side of this fight and died for the same reasons that a lot of Irishmen died other places. So I hope that all of us, in a way, in our own ways, remember that there are continuities. The continuities of all immigrant groups go on. We shouldn't repeat again the pain that was inflicted on people when they first showed up in this amazing country, that we should be able to walk around in the Tenement Museum on Orchard Street and remember where we came from, and make sure that nobody else has to go through some of the things that some of us did, and that we all can help people get up after they've been knocked down. So thank you for having me here tonight. And I'd be delighted to answer any questions that anybody might have. I promise I'm not running for office. I had one sister. I had one sister, Kathleen. Still have one sister. I talked to her all the time. She was the one in the family that never drank. So when I was writing this book, for example, I would say, Kathleen, you walk into Senyu's candy store. There was a long tray of candies stacked up on the front counter. What was at the bottom? Oh, lifesavers. She remembered everything. And there's a wonderful woman. She could have been a very good writer if she wanted to, but she's a terrific editor too, and full of laughter. But my father liked her more than any of us because she was born on his birthday, on May 1st. So every May 1st we had a big thing for the two of them. Later on, when after my first marriage failed and I had custody of my two daughters, the two daughters did a variation of that. They would give me a party every Mother's Day because I had to do both gigs. But my mother lived to be 87. She was an amazingly decent person. I remember a mugging she was mugged one time, right on Prospect Park West, not in the wrong end of town, by two dumbbells who mugged her and banged her head against the fence. Around the corner came a police car and arrested these two master criminals right away. One of them had gotten out of jail the day before, When their trial came up, she asked the judge to be merciful to them. I wanted to throw them under the Prospect Park bus. And if we had punishment by relatives only, there wouldn't have been much to send to jail if all the brothers got a hold of these two guys. But she had that decency. And she retired once, which was like shocking to all of us. She retired at 70. And she's home alone with my father, who's getting deafer and deafer. And I remember so clearly my brother Dennis and I going to visit one day in Brooklyn. He's there alone, my father. He's watching Dating Game at full volume. And he sees us and he come in and he's, I can't figure out the plot of this goddamn thing. So Dennis falls on the floor. But my mother, when he was calling my mother later that night to tell him about the Dating Game, so she had a good laugh out of that. But she explained, I'm going back to work. And Dennis says, why? He says, if I stay here, I'll be deaf by Christmas. So she went back and worked for TB for a couple of more years before this mugging that I told you about, which left her with a kind of Parkinson's, But they had the sense of humor, I think, is what he had a sense of humor, but the more deaf he got, he couldn't figure out the jokes, Even when they were about him, he had no idea. But I remember visiting her at the end where she was in a nursing home in Staten Island. And I saw the difference between the men and the women. The women were all talking to each other. They had the projects they were working on. They were doing stuff. They would have a lot of laughs. The men were the worst human beings ever. Cranky. This is not a sausage. That kind of stuff. Cranky old. No wonder their wives died before they did, out of a sense of relief, But the men were so awful. And there were men that would come into this nursing home in Staten Island and put up calendars for undertakers. I I'd walk in and say, what the hell is this? Lift it off. To have the undertaker looking down at the bed, like in a nursing home was like, but she had fun even there. So the sense of humor, and you find it a lot, it wasn't unique to her. And it wasn't unique to the Irish. The older Jewish ladies would be the same kind of stock, all the jokes. The old Italian ladies, same thing, except they wore more black, and had the sense to go to the church and stay warm in the wintertime. But it was the kind of neighborhood where you got to know all those people, particularly fairly young. When you were young, I was a delivery boy. All my brothers all delivered groceries and all that. You got to know who lived on the top floor right. Some poor woman whose family was either kids were gone and the husband was dead, couldn't maneuver the stairs anymore. And one thing they loved is to be able to talk. And all you had to do was listen, which is one of the things that helped me as a reporter later on. Listen, stop talking. Listen to what they say and how they say it. So there were a lot of people like that still in those neighborhoods. Now it's mainly NYU students living in tenements at 15 times the rent we paid. Mainly because, again, the neighborhoods changed because the commerce of the port disappeared. Once containerization came to the docks, you couldn't really have enough room for the big trucks to move around and take the containers, so they all started moving to Port Elizabeth, and the jobs went with them. It wasn't the yuppies drove them out. It was the world changed. But the sense of fun, the sense of learning from the many different ways it was to live, because it really was Italians, Irish, and then a handful of working class Jews. And I also had the good fortune to be the Shabbos Goy in a synagogue, where I'm going to speak in December, and which led to my novel, Snow in August. That experience. Yes, ma'am. That's true. I didn't drive a car till I was 36. Well, in California, I couldn't buy cigarettes unless I could drive. And I was out there working on a couple of things, and I finally learned how to drive. I hated it. I still do. I haven't driven a car in 4 or 5 years. I can't afford the parking lots. Park Slope, they have condominiums for cars. Yeah. But I don't do it now. You don't really need it in a city with this many subways. One right downstairs.
I'm currently reading a book, Beyond the Golden Door, which is a combination biography and autobiography of William O'Dwyer that was in part written by his brother, Paul O'Dwyer. And I would like to know, have you ever heard of the book, and if you have any comments about it?
I have the book home. The book itself could be better because the story is very interesting. I mean, of Bill O'Dwyer. I mean, there's a case where to get educated, he ended up in Salamanca, Spain, which meant that he could speak a little Spanish, which is why after he got in trouble in New York, he was the ambassador to Mexico. So the threads that go from Salamanca to 19th century Ireland are pretty interesting to develop. But I didn't know Bill O'Dwyer, but I knew Paul, who was one of the best guys I ever knew in my life. Paul used to take me to the only good St. Patrick's Day party I ever went to. It was every year, and I went about 5 years in a row with Paul. It was at a place on Lower 2nd Avenue and 2nd Street. Well, Moskowitz and Lupowitz. And so you had all these guys singing the worst Irish songs with Yiddish accents, the waiters, Danny boy, me later, but the food was great. And Paul loved it because it was so bad. The places like Moskowitz and Lupowitz, for example, the whole tradition of corned beef and cabbage. There was no corned beef in Ireland. But nobody, most immigrants didn't know anybody from other parts of Ireland. Some of them left in the 19th century, left from the west of Ireland without ever seeing Dublin. And suddenly they're on Broadway in Duane Street or something, seeing more people in half an hour than they did in their entire lives. So they didn't know anything about corned beef. And so they somehow, corned beef and cabbage, some smart guy, I'm sure somebody from Cass's Delicatessen on Houston Street, convinced the Irish that this was one of the great traditional Irish. And his friend Brian Boru gave him the recipe or something. And pretty soon you'd go in certain Irish restaurants in Dublin, and they'd have corned beef and cabbage. You'd say, so Sholem Aleichem would have loved that scene. Yes, sir. With Archie the manager speaking? That Duffy's Tavern? The radio show? No, I would hear it on the radio. I never saw it on television. Duffy's Tavern. Archie the manager speaking, Duffy ain't here. Yeah. But there were a lot of those ethnic programs that were kind of fun. I mean, there was Life with Luigi, which got all the Italians crazy, because by the time Life with Luigi came on with all these guys named Pasta Fazool or something, by then the whole image of the Italian organ grinder with the monkey was gone because of three people. Fiorello LaGuardia, Joe DiMaggio, and Frank Sinatra had totally changed the image of Italian Americans forever. It never went back. So some of the radio shows, Amos and Andy is a classic. I would hate to be African American who knew what Charlie Parker was doing with a saxophone, or how Ralph Ellison was writing in his new book, listening to Amos and Andy. Some of the jokes were pretty funny in a raunchy, vulgar, racist, stupid way, and I think a lot of people had fun for a while, but they didn't survive. They couldn't do them. Television was too blatant, even though they came on for a while. They had runs. And maybe it was better when people laughed at the differences instead of getting angry. I don't know. It's something worth really certainly thinking about. I mean, one of the big plays on Broadway in the 20s was A.B.'s Irish Rose, about a Jewish-Irish marriage. In my neighborhood, a mixed marriage was a Yankee fan and a Dodger fan. You couldn't bear to do that, But again, I don't know. I mean, it would have to be, it's worth a real study to see how those ethnic mass culture things worked and why they rose and why they faded. Why they became popular and why they faded. It might have been that just laughing at the differences helped in a way. I don't know. Because I know there's certain jokes you didn't tell in my neighborhood. Thank you all for having me. Thank you.